by flooding. So it's up there as one of the most significant natural disasters, and also one of the most difficult ones to deal with. Next, please. So it's obviously it's important. We need to understand what it is, understand the hazard itself. It's various aspects of it, and it is fairly complicated. But we also need to understand the risk and the impacts of it in order to work out what it is we can do about it. So we've covered the whole range from understanding the basics of where it comes from, what it consists of, and the impacts. And then what do we do about it? But Matthias will cover that in a lot more detail later. Next slide, please. So, okay, next slide. So clearly there's an infinite range of sort of potential flood risk assessments that you could carry out in all sorts of levels of detail. But we've kind of identified three main categories. So they're preliminary category. Category one is a kind of tends to, and these categories are not only the level of detail, but also typically the sort of the scale and the extent of the coverage of the study. So preliminary tends to be more of a sort of national scale study. So it's a fairly high level assessment that doesn't go into a great deal of detail, but it's very important as an initial sort of starting point, and starting to build discussions and relationships with clients, with country clients. The level 3 study, it is at the other end of the spectrum. It's far more detailed, and it's more focused. It could be on a particular structure, it could be on a river, it could be a particular part of a city or whatever, but it's not something that typically the bank would get involved in themselves. It's normally something that would be carried out by others, and it's more to do with defining the detail of the project, looking at the feasibility, looking at design, that kind of thing. So it's not something the bank would normally get involved with directly. Whereas the strategic level, as we're calling it, is probably where most of the important decisions or key decisions are made, and so it's important to get this part of it right, and actually understand the basis of these decisions, so it can directly feed into the sort of the early planning process and the sort of pre-feasibility process or stages, and actually help develop the planning process for ongoing investments, and then leading into projects. So next slide, please. So as we've already said, these kind of studies are challenging. They combine a lot of complex technical and non-technical factors. We've got a list here, but essentially it's things like data uncertainty, modeling, and combining that with things that are less tangible as well. So environmental, social, all of these aspects tend to make the overall process potentially quite complicated and difficult. So it's quite a lot to kind of work through, and as one specific project. So next, please. Next slide. Also, to throw into the mix of the complexity, there's different types of flooding, and I know if you're standing and you've got half a meter of water in your house, where the water has come from and exactly how it's got there, it isn't of that much importance to you. But when it comes to actually doing something about it and understanding how to prevent it and or how to deal with it in some way, it is important to understand where it's come from. So we've got there's four sort of main categories here. River or fluvial floods, as we often call them, is where the water in the river, the water spills out of the river onto the land and causes flooding. So there's a lack of capacity in whatever the channel is or whatever is carrying the water. The pluvial flooding or surface water flooding, as it's sometimes known, is kind of the reverse of that. It's where water can't get into the river or the water channel, and so that tends to be more of a sort of drainage issue. It tends to be less severe and less damaging, but it probably happens more often, so it's more of a problem or more of a nuisance problem in some cases. Coastal flooding, mainly caused by high winds, storm surge, that kind of thing, but can be extremely damaging when it occurs, but also it needs to be considered when these sort of high sea levels can actually influence the drainage of cities. And so it may not be a direct cause of flooding, but it needs to be something that is considered. And then flash floods, well, flash floods is a bit of a grey area. It's difficult to define exactly what a flash flood is, but it's typically rapid onset of flooding that's usually coming from sort of localized, maybe high ground, rapid runoff. So there's high velocities, and as I said, rapid onset. So you don't know what's happening. You don't know you can't predict it very easily, and so it tends to be the most damaging. And this is usually where most of the losses of life will occur. So next, please, next slide. Next one. So yeah, so as I've said already, there are lots of disciplines, lots of skills necessary in carrying out a flood risk assessment. So we just listed the three sort of main stages of a flood risk assessment. There's lots of parts to this, but looking at these main three stages, the first one is the flood hazard assessment itself. So that usually involves, well, almost invariably involves hydrology. So there's quite often hydrological modeling set up. It can often involve oceanography. It may involve meteorology, but it certainly involves some kind of assessment of hydrometric parameters. So there's a range of data related kind of topics in there. Then there's hydraulics as the modeling aspect of it. Again, quite a complicated, quite a specialist skill, and GIS and the mapping stages of the process. And then for the flood risk assessment, that brings in, when we start looking at vulnerability and exposure, that starts bringing in other skills, so economics, finance, physical and social geography, and again GIS processing. But in this case, it's slightly more complicated, more sophisticated, and involves analysis of data more than just mapping. So at this stage the GIS is a bit more complex. And then evaluation of interventions. So that again involves some new disciplines: planning, engineering, environmental, and social assessments. And throughout the whole process, really, there's the institutional and community awareness, and the need for consultation, etc. So the need. Oh, it's okay. Yeah, next slide, please. Yeah, finish that one. So yeah, recognizing the importance of the topic and the many challenges, technical and the social, environmental, engineering, economic assessments that are involved, we decided, as we've discussed already, really, that we needed some sort of reference document. So we focused it mainly on sort of non-specialist practitioners. There's a lot of technical information in there, but we try to present it in a kind of non-technical way that hopefully is practical. And that really, the emphasis is on this document is a practical guidance. And so in theory, you can dip in and look at particular aspects of it that you're particularly dealing with at that time. So next slide, please. I think I've said that already. Yes, mainly focused on the non-specialists, strategic level, and this is hoped will. Next slide, please. So the idea behind it, obviously, is to ensure that we comply with the sort of the technical and the industry standards. And so it's not just the bank's methods, but this is a kind of general methods that are employed by others and have been developed over decades, really. So it's a well-established kind of set of processes. So that will ensure that the results are consistent, compatible, and comparable. And comparable is important because there's no point in doing this if everybody else is doing it differently, because you will then at the end you're not going to be able to compare results, and just makes decision making almost impossible. It will improve the actual quality of the outputs, the quality and the robustness, so they're more defendable. We know how these outputs have been developed. We know they've followed a consistent approach, and we know we can rely on them. So that will lead to better decision-making, planning processes, and support more effective and efficient project delivery. And overall, basically, it'll improve efficiency and cost effectiveness and the usefulness of these kind of studies. Next slide, please. So we're focusing on urban, as we've said. Although it's obviously the scope is global, but we are focusing mainly on urban environments. Because that was, as we've said, is where the need was seen, the greatest need was seen. But it's also worth pointing out and noting, I think, that a lot of flooding actually generated outside the city, and so the study, what the content, the processes and procedures and the technical discussion that's in the document actually applies to more rural catchments as well. And it also that then carries on to the looking at the potential interventions and things. So we're not just looking purely at the city; we are looking at what actually affects the surrounding areas as well. So yeah, it is urban, but it does make sure we have made sure it covers everything that affects the urban environment. Next, please. So the audience, well, as we've said already, well, actually, we can go to the next slide. So we have focused it on the World Bank, and this is, I guess, the main sort of users. It forms an evidence base for discussion with the country and clients. It allows for investment planning and project development. And it also allows for a due diligence process, so to make sure that actually what is being proposed does make sense and we can justify it. But I think it's also worth mentioning that the document is going to be publicly available, or generally more widely available. It's obviously not going to be published, but publicly, but it is available for anybody. And we're hoping that consultants, other firms, agencies, and maybe educational programs will take it up and use it. And the benefit of that obviously will be that consultants will understand what the bank needs, and they put them in a better position. Obviously, commercially, they understand what they need to do to deliver the projects, but also it helps us because they know what they're doing. So yeah, I think next slide, please. I think that's possibly all from me. Yes, that's it. So I'll hand you over to Matthias now. Thank you.
Thanks, Scott. Can I see the next slide? Next slide, please. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, thanks for handing over, Scott. I'd like to continue and give you a bit of a flavor in the second part of this presentation about, let's say, what is actually in the handbook. The handbook is structured along 5 phases that you see on this slide, starting with project scoping, then hazard modeling, risk modeling, exploring interventions, and finally some considerations about project management and closeout. Next slide, please. So the project scoping is a very important phase. It's generally done between, let's say, the bank staff or consultants from the bank and the stakeholders, but when the consultant is still not yet on board. And the aim of this phase is to very clearly define the scope of the assignment, and it's a very important phase to really align with the stakeholders on what do we want to get out of it. Next slide. So here we have listed a couple of elements that are important, let's say, to consider during the project scoping phase, and let me just pick out 2 today to discuss. One is, of course, the aim. The aim of such an urban flood risk assessment is extremely important to very clearly articulate at the start of the project. And what do we precisely want to know? With what level of detail do we want to know it? How does it fit into the dialogue between the bank and also the stakeholders? And what exactly results and deliverables are necessary? And the other thing is also on the key stakeholders and institutional setting, which is listed here. It's very important in the beginning of such an assignment to identify who are the key stakeholders in country or in the city that must be involved in such an assignment. What are broadly their mandates and responsibilities? What data can they provide? And how will they be engaged throughout the whole process? So answering all of these and the other elements will help to really align between stakeholders, the bank, but also consultants, in terms of expectations and use of the results. So investing time in this particular phase of project scoping will definitely pay off during the assignment. Next slide, please. So when it comes to phase 2, to the flood hazard modeling and mapping, it's about understanding the flood characteristics for all possible scenarios, and it's often expressed in terms of flood extent, flood depth, flood velocities, but also flood duration. Next slide, please. So in this phase, let's say here's a list of elements that are important to consider. I'm not going to discuss them in all because of time, but let me pick out the aspect of calibration and validation in this case. In the countries and the cities that we normally work in, the amount of data is generally limited to calibrate and validate these models. But ultimately, I think it's very important that we end up with credible flood maps, and therefore it's very important to really define a strategy and make sure that the consultant has a strategy how to calibrate and validate the results that come out of these numerical models. It can, for instance, be very important to also do a detailed kind of check, sanity check themselves, but also work with the stakeholders, because there's often a lot of local knowledge on where flooding occurs in the urban environments that we work in. Also about mapping and visualization is very important. Flood maps for technicians are probably, let's say, very clear, but for ultimately flood maps, let's say, communicate hazard, and it should also be used could also be used for other programs to raise awareness. So it's very important to think about how to visualize actually the results. Is it easily accessible? Can it be easily comprehended by non-technicians? And also, for instance, I think about color schemes. Certain colors can mean very different things in many different contexts in many different countries. So all these kind of things must be thought through very carefully. Next slide, please. Then phase 3 is about the flood risk assessment. And this is, well, it's about the quantification of the impacts of floods. And technically, it's complex because it's a combination of hazard and exposure and vulnerability. Next slide, please. This slide shows these 3 elements, like hazards, exposure, and vulnerability, also graphically. And let me zoom into the aspect of vulnerability, because that's probably, let's say, the least known piece of the puzzle very often. Also in terms of data, vulnerability refers to the degree to which an exposed element is impacted by the hazard, and often this is being modeled through vulnerability curves. If it comes, for instance, to an asset such as a building, a vulnerability curve expresses the percentage of damage as a function of, for example, increasing water depth. But one can imagine that this is very much depending on the type of building. So if it's a house built from basic materials, then the vulnerability is very much different from if the building is built from brick or concrete. So carefully selecting and also checking vulnerability curves and tailoring it to the very local context is extremely essential to end up with realistic risk results. Next slide, please. So phase 4 is about exploring interventions. So based on the hazard and risk results, but also the wider context analysis of the stakeholders and the mandates and the whole situation, this phase focuses on defining appropriate measures, how to buy down risk. The next slide. This slide presents 5 key questions that are relevant during this exploration of interventions. And selection of interventions relevant for a specific context is obviously very important. This can be structural, but also non-structural. And within the structural domain, we often make a distinction between gray and green, or nature-based, if you will. But in reality, often the combination or hybrid solutions make a lot of sense in urban environments. And so benefits, including co-benefits, costs, but also environmental and social aspects, are very important to screen all these options and to converge to a set of prioritized measures to reduce the risk. It's noted in such a level 2 assessment that Scott was referring to, and a full environmental and social impact assessment is not done. That's typically left for the phase 3 or for the level 3 assessments. But it's very important already at this stage, let's say, to identify any kind of environmental or social showstoppers for implementation. Like, for instance, extensive land acquisition could be one, or a very extensive resettlement. It's also often could be, let's say, a very important issue for implementation. And this phase 4 typically ends with a strategic investment plan as a product. That is then being used as a dialogue between the bank and the client for further discussion about prioritization. Defining, let's say, short-term, mid-term, and long-term kind of interventions with a price tag and with any kind of other considerations for implementation. Next one. So last but not least, the handbook gives some insight in some typical project management considerations for managing an urban flood risk assessment. Next one. And all these management issues, they have been based on, let's say, various lessons learned from earlier projects. This is a piece I think is very valuable, also when setting up a new flood risk assessment, to avoid making the mistakes of the past, and also try to do it better and better in the future. And one particular aspect is for instance, the project closeout. That's a lesson learned, I think, from any project, that if you do the project closeout well, if you make sure that all the data and all the models are properly archived or handed over to our clients, and that can save a lot of time and effort for any kind of downstream work. If a client goes into feasibility studies, then all these models and all this data can be quickly reopened and also reused for that piece of the work. Next slide. So getting near to the end of the presentation, this handbook is of course nice, but at the end of the day, it's about, let's say, how to put it into practice. And if you think about, let's say, the practicalities of these kind of urban flood risk assessments, then one thing to remember is that it is not an exact science, flood hazard and risk modeling. There will always be expert judgment necessary. There will always be data gaps. There will always be missing information. It's also good to remember that the flood risk assessment, an urban flood risk assessment, and such a strategic document, of course, is not the goal in itself. But ultimately, it's about, let's say, moving towards implementation and moving, whether it's structural or non-structural solutions. And therefore, striving to accurate results is, of course, good. But you should also remember that if you start to strive for, let's say, extremely accurate results, then it can escalate the cost enormously, and that should be avoided. So keeping it roughly right, I think, is a very important kind of idea that should come in these type of assessments. Next slide. Yeah, so various urban flood risk assessments have been completed in recent years, and here are just a couple of them are mentioned. But I think the list is much longer than these cities that I mentioned here. But what is really encouraging to me and also to others is that these studies have led to agreements between countries and the bank to implement projects to reduce risks and also boost urban upgrading. So one of these examples that I'm showing here is an example of Paramaribo, the capital of Suriname in South America. It's a project that both Scott and I have been working on. Scott has been working on the initial, say, level 2 assignment, and that has led to an agreement between the bank and the government of Suriname to invest, I think, around $30 million to upgrade one of the main drains of the city, the so-called Sarabaka Canal, and also to do a so-called level 3 study for the city to define, let's say, downstream investments to further upgrade the entire drainage system, because the city floods very irregularly. And I think this is what I and we as a team, we wish to for all these urban flood risk assessments, that these will ultimately result in interventions to reduce risk. And hopefully the handbook can be instrumental to achieve this. Thank you. I hand it over back to Anna.
Thanks very much, Scott and Tess. I hope it has been comprehensive, and of course you will be able to see a lot more of the details in the handbook. Please remember to start writing your questions in the chat or keeping your questions for the last part of this session. We will continue now with the presentation about the flood framework agreement by Ross, and he will explain also how we, besides of going into understanding what's required technically to do the right level of assessments with the time we have within project preparation and the budgets we normally manage within the trust funds, how to try to make the process of procurement a little bit more efficient, how to accumulate some knowledge from process to process, and how to share those experiences across the different teams. So over to Ross to explain a little bit how that works and what is the state of the implementation of the framework.
Great. Thanks very much, Anna. Excuse me. So I'll just remind everyone, if you're on the World Bank campus today, you're welcome to come to the room, not only for breakfast, but also for your free copy of the handbook. And if you'd rather see it online, it's available on the CRP website, the GFDRR website, and the World Bank's Open Knowledge Repository. And I'm just dropping a link right now into the chat for that. So if you're a World Bank TTL or part of a World Bank task team, now you have the handbook, you have this great guidance. And what do you do when it comes to actually implementing a flood risk assessment study in your role at the World Bank? So in the next few minutes, I'll take us through some steps which you can do that using the City Resilience Program's Framework Agreement for Urban Flood Risk Assessment. Next slide. We'll do this by answering 8 key questions along the way. We have 1 slide per question. So first, what is a World Bank Framework Agreement in general? What is the What is the Urban Flood Risk Assessments Framework Agreement, specifically in our case? Why have we established this specific framework agreement on urban flood risk assessments? What qualifies to be part of this framework? And what does it actually cover in terms of the implementation and material? How does the framework agreement work in practice? And what have been some of the key benefits that we've seen so far in its implementation? And how has it actually been used? Next slide. So let's start with what is a framework at the World Bank. Essentially, World Bank Framework Agreement is a contract vehicle that aggregates demand from our task teams and in turn from their clients. And it ensures a continuity of supply of some level of a particular set of services, which in our case have defined to be related to urban flood risk. A framework establishes and governs the terms and conditions of the future call-off contracts for the specific pieces of work that will happen under the framework. So the framework doesn't guarantee anyone any work or any particular studies, but it helps govern everything that happens later on under it. It also locks in specific costs upfront mainly related to the daily rates for specialists that then apply to all future costs under the call-off contracts. And crucially, each assignment under the framework is then advertised only to those specific vendors that have already won access to the framework umbrella in that competitive process. Next slide. So what is the specific urban flood risk assessments framework? So as Anna mentioned, we've implemented this framework agreement in order to understand why, where, and to what extent flood risks occur in cities and help our task teams and their clients make better investments in urban flood risk adaptation and resilience. The framework is managed and supported by the City Resilience Program in GFDRR. It's a completely free service to task teams. The maximum value of all the call-off contracts under it is $10 million We've reached about 5 million just over 2 years in. So we're on a good clip here so far. And its maximum duration is 5 years. We have 4 vendors under the framework. So these are the 4 vendors that won the competitive award of the framework at the start of it, and are now the ones who receive the specific call-up contracts for their individual scopes of work. And those are Arup, Deltaris, Jeremy Benn Associates, and Royal Haskoning, who we've evaluated to offer the best-in-class service to our task teams. So why did we establish one in the first place? Well, we know that there's been, you don't need to look far to see the news, that there's a significant increase in urban flooding globally from all sorts of causes, which Scott and Matthias talked about, which have escalated the client needs that we see. Therefore, urban flooding has been a really major growing part of our portfolio, especially in the urban and DRM practices, as well as other practices too, such as the water and transport GPs. At the same time, when we put out tenders for these sorts of work, and we receive proposals, they're not always necessarily that straightforward to address. You can see a lot of variation and variety in the kinds of proposals you receive. Comparing one to another isn't always so easy either. And that's often related to the fact that hydrology, hydraulics, et cetera, are really complex issues, and urban flood risk itself is really complicated and complex and requires some very specialized skills and expertise to assess and to model. For these reasons, and the repeated demand that we saw of teams facing these challenges, that's where the framework came from. Next slide. So quickly on what qualifies to be part of the framework. It's a global service, could be for any region bank. Can also be for any value, any assignment value. Typically, we see things between 50 or 100 to 500K, but any value is eligible. It is for bank executed work only, rather than recipient executed work. And it covers a wide and extensive set of services. So the next slide, we cover that. The next slide. I won't mention each one of these, but this is just to illustrate that there's plenty of services that are covered under the framework, everything from initial data collection and management and geospatial and hydrological analysis. This includes coastal process analysis, all the way through risk modeling, future climate change and growth projections, of course, the intervention optioneering that we spoke about earlier, policy recommendations, and stakeholder and community engagement. And can be used for a wide variety of cases, informing, of course, our projects, engaging with our clients early on in a engagement with new clients, perhaps, and then projecting changes across different future climate change and growth scenarios, and a lot more. How does it work in practice? You're a World Bank task team leader. So typically, the way it works is that we'll start out with some template and example terms of reference that we can offer to the task teams to adapt to the particular use case in which they're working. We find it's really important that the task team, of course, maintains ownership of the assignment itself, but we help with every step of the process along the way. And at the CRP, we'll then support the team to scope and develop the assignment by developing the most robust and technically strong TORs that we possibly can, all within procurement guidelines, which we've come to know very well. Once the TORs have been agreed on, then we will run a mini bid process with those 4 vendors. So what this means essentially is that we skip the whole expression of interest phase, and it goes directly to the 4 vendors for bidding, which saves quite a bit of time. We've also saved quite a bit of time in the TOR preparation phase. I think we've heard in many cases sometimes that going back and forth with procurement to prepare the TORs can take 6 months. Typically, we don't really receive any comments back from procurement at this point. So that process is fairly quick as well. And then once the mini bid is completed, we'll assist with the evaluation, with the scoring of the proposals. If there's any negotiations or technical clarifications that are needed, we'll also manage that process. But typically anything at that stage is related to technical clarification because the rates have already been locked in. We'll then manage the contract procurement process and the administration of it. And once it's been awarded, then it's sort of handed back over in many respects to the task team for the management of the implementation of the assignment. Though, of course, we remain available throughout the life cycle of the assignment to ensure any framework level quality control or support for any issues that may arise. That slide. Okay, and so we've now had about 2 years with the framework. So we've seen, we and the task teams have realized a fair bit of benefits and advantages to going this route. One is that there's more flexible and fast procurement. So as mentioned earlier, we skipped the EOI phase. The TOI preparation phase is much quicker. And the process of reaching the award is also quicker as we go through the technical clarifications. We have improved concise TORs and proposals. So the TORs have been adaptable, but also standardized quite a bit to make sure that they include all the key pieces and reduce any confusion that may arise on the part of the firms who may be bidding. So the TORs are a bit more concise, and importantly for us, for everyone, when we reach the proposal phase, the proposals are also more concise. So there's basically less to read and to wade through when we're actually doing the evaluation. And this also makes it easier on the part of the firms to prepare the proposals too. Access to best-in-class services. So we have regular discussions with the 4 firms to make sure that if any key innovations we see in the market can be incorporated into their service offering. And the daily rates are already defined, so therefore minimal negotiations are needed. Yes, we ensure that all the financial proposals are in line with what's been proposed in the framework, so there's no sort of questions or issues there when it comes to the financial part. Sharing of best practices. So this is something that happens, but I would say both internally amongst our World Bank teams, as well as between the firms and across the bank and the firms. So we're really, I'd say this speaks to developing a bit of a community of practice around urban flood risk between us and the private sector amongst these vendors, where our task teams now get to learn from prior assignments in terms of implementation and preparation, and also what to expect along the way from the implementation of the assignments. And the firms are a bit, they also know what to expect too from us and what the bank really wants to see. So there's typically a lot less sort of back and forth and delays in implementation that we might have seen in other assignments where there's a little more uncertainty at the start. And finally, we realized we're working on data interoperability and quality standards, and this refers to another GFDRR initiative for what's known as the risk data library standard, which is essentially providing a common standard and language for describing all sorts of risk-related data, not just for flooding, but really any kind of risk, including hazard, exposure, and vulnerability. And this will be launched in the coming couple months. And by ensuring that data that have been outputted from all these different assignments are able to speak to one another, it'll really promote the interoperability of different assignments, different stakeholders who are working in one place, and able to pick up what work that's already been done and not having to reinvent the wheel each time, and have data that's more legible and readable right from the start. Next slide, thanks. How's it been used so far? Well, in just under 2 years, in terms of those assignments that have been contracted, there have been 18 assignments covering 60 different cities in almost all regions of the bank. I think the exception is MENA. and this covers 5.3 million so far. So if you have any questions about the framework, or if you have an assignment that you're currently scoping out or considering, feel free to reach out and we can share some TORs and discuss moving to the next steps. Next slide. Wanted to give one quick plug. You've seen a version of this slide before, but just to say that given the volume of work that's come under this framework, there's been additional interest in establishing another framework in an area of more repeated demand too. And this is in risk-informed land use planning. The purpose for this is to prevent new and reduce existing climate and disaster risk in the design, development, and implementation of all sorts of risk-informed land use planning and development control policies and practices. And like the flood risk handbook, it is managed by us. It's almost for 10 million. And it's for another 5 years in duration. The vendors are TBD because we are in the procurement and RFP process right now, but this will be active in the coming few months, and we're happy to speak with you and prepare some assignments in this topic as well. Slide. That's it from me, and I think we can turn it over back to Anna to lead the discussion.
Thank you very much, Ross. And I hope this clarified a little bit what is the scheme that has been organized to try to implement these flood assessments, and what is the technical assistance that the city resilience program can provide within that process. I recommend everyone to start posting your questions before we reach to the Q&A session. I will hand it over now to Claudia Soto. As I mentioned, she's a senior disaster risk management specialist working in West Africa and leading the dialogue in Niger. And she will talk about her experience of using the flood framework process for the project assessment in Niger. So over to you, Claudia.
Thank you so much. Do you mind passing the Thank you. So as Anna said, I'm going to give a little bit of the user perspective and talk a bit about the operationality of this framework agreement and also the methodology as a whole. So in terms of relevance of doing flood risk assessments as part of bank operations and bank TA, I think there's a consensus that this is relevant. We do have a lot of demand for urban resilience projects in West Africa, which aim at reducing flood risk and also promoting resilient urban management. Assessments help in two ways. So the first way obviously is into defining flood risk reduction measures and investment plans, and also to guide land use planning and city planning in a more resilient way. And we do find those two activities very often in our projects. So this is very much relevant for operations. And as it was mentioned before in the presentation, conducting flood risk assessments is not an easy task. It's a very complex endeavor, especially because urban areas are highly dense, have high densities and extensive infrastructure networks, and this requires very high quality and high resolution data to conduct flood modeling. And many times this data is not available as part of the government, and this is where urban operations financed by the World Bank can add value and really help kind of develop and make available those data, right? And I think the urban flood handbook and the framework agreement as a whole really offers benefits to teams, and it provides a standardized and practical and also cost-effective approach to conducting the flood risk assessments. I think the value of the team that was connected here is very high, and I appreciate the help of Matthias and Scott and the rest of the team and Ross in all the technical assistance that has been given throughout the TA. And really this methodology help us really define the project investments and also provide a technical assistance overall on a longer period of time. I mean, right now we've been working with Niger for more than 1 year, And this is a very high value for our clients, definitely. However, there are still some challenges that we need to consider. I mean, this is not, let's say, always only positive things, and I think that we need to work through those challenges, and I think we've done it very well in Niger. So a major challenge that I think we need to keep in mind is issues of capacity in countries, right? Because all of this is done through bank TA, and this is great, right? But we need to look, let's say, forward and say one day the bank will not be there. Is there capacity in countries to conduct these flood assessments? And of course, this is the first step, right? So one thing is the capacity, so the technical capacity within governments, especially within cities in conducting those flood risk assessments in terms of modeling, hydrology, hydraulic engineering, GIS and mapping, and you know, how do we develop that capacity over time? So that's one thing that maybe this TA can, you know, help kind of define and help teams look forward a little bit more. There's also issues of institutional challenges. I think in theory, this is very good, but there are many institutions that are responsible for flood risk at the city level. We have sectors, we have cities, we have communities that are involved. So how can we be more upfront about the challenges of institutional coordination, which I think in Niger was a huge hurdle. And I think at some point we found a way to kind of go around it, especially in an FCV environment. How do we kind of make this more easy? And finally, the financial challenges, no, the capacity to finance this type of assessments, which are very expensive actually. So we finance them. This is great, but at some point projects will have to do it, and governments outside of bank funding will have to do it. So how to finance the assessments and also how to finance the investments. I mean, these flood risk assessments, they provide, you know, an investment plan that's very expensive. So how do we prepare clients to say, okay, you're going to get a document and it's going to cost you a lot of money, especially in low capacity, lower income countries. The communication of the financial needs can be difficult. The good thing is that we do have IPFs, we have or other type of instruments in the bank to kind of address that. But I think this needs to kind of be discussed up front. What is the next step after we do these assessments, and how do we go from this kind of theoretical, you know, methodology and assessment to something that is very practical and that we can finance in the medium and longer run. So those are kind of like the three challenges that I found, and I think there are challenges that we can overcome altogether, but it's good to kind of keep them in mind. And finally, one thing that I think we can use these kind of risk assessments for is to create kind of a multi-sectorial platform for other sectors. That's what we're trying to do in Niger, is to kind of sit around the table with the education, transport, health teams on how to use these assessments to plan for infrastructure and ensure that this infrastructure is not in risky areas. So that's one thing. And another thing that we can use this for is also to plan for resilient construction practices. And I think GFDRR does have a team for that, but maybe this is also an entry point to discuss with other sectors on how to address resilient infrastructure in a high flood risk context. And I stop here. Thank you to the team.
Thanks very much, Claudia. I will hand it over now to Horacio Terraza. He's a lead urban specialist in South Asia, and he is connected virtually today.
Hi, thank you, Anna, and hi, everybody. I'm going to be short, but just telling you a very concrete example that we have working with the team, with Ross and the team. We applied this in the Surat project. This is Surat is a city on the west coast of India, and it's 14 kilometers from the Arabic Sea. And the main problem that the city is going through is that suffering recurrent floodings, and the river that runs through the city, that is called the Tapi River, also is highly polluted because of the sewage situation. So the last big flooding that they had was in 2006, and 300 people died. The flow of the river is controlled by a big dam that they have 100 kilometers above the city. And they have had several different interventions to control flood over time, but all of them have been patches with different technical characteristics. So what are we trying to do with this project? The essence of the project is to have an holistic view. This is not only going to deal with the flooding aspects on the sewage control, but it's going to use the flood control elements and infrastructure that is going to be built to develop a huge public space new for the city. The idea is that the city is going to turn now is giving its back to the city, is to connect the city back to the river. So to create a big recreational public space, to create new urban development along both banks of the river, to do economic development also along the banks of the river, mobility along the banks. So that is the main concept of the project. What was the problem that we had to do this is that we had different institutions at state level, national level, and municipal level, that they have different values for flow, and for different recurring periods. So it was very hard to determine which one was, and the range was huge. I mean, it was 100% in some cases, the differences. So we needed to do a flood risk assessment. And at the same time, when we were discussing this, we took the authorities of the city of Surat to the Netherlands to visit and to learn how the Dutch were dealing with that, and how they were including the room for the river concept. So the mayor liked the idea that was incorporated in project design, and we came back with the idea of how important this flood risk assessment was. It was key. Why? Because this is going to determine the whole master plan along the river, how tall the embankments are going to be, how the infrastructure, how far is going to be, we're going to leave room for the river, etc. Without the risk, the flood risk assessment, the project is not feasible. So what we did is we contacted Ross, and what we found, it was extremely friendly and useful to work with them, because first of all, they have standardized the process of connecting with the teams. So what we did is, first of all, we discussed technically. We have our own hydraulic engineer, and Ross and the team have their own. So what we did is we came up with terms of reference, discussing that. Then the procurement process was extremely easy to go through, as they have it set up. The local authorities were really keen on working with Deltares, because we had visited the lab in the Netherlands. Deltares was one of the firms, as Royal Haskellin, as Serop, and Deltares was chosen in the end. So the client is very happy with that. And it has also been super important to maintain the technical dialogue all along the process, not only the procurement one, but also now that the study is being implemented. And actually the final flow value for the final design is going to be determined next week in Surat. So we are almost arriving to the end of the process. So again, highly recommended to work with the team. And I'm going to stop here.
Perfect. Thanks very much, Horacio. I will hand it over now to Nick Calendar to tell us a little bit about the experience in Burundi.
Thanks, Ana. So maybe just very briefly to complement what Claudia and Horacio mentioned, and just speak from my experience of the service. I think I have Ross on my word speed dial. Really, I think I've used it about 3 times this contract, so it's been very useful, I think, to the work we've done, and maybe to speak a bit to the experience in Burundi, which has been the more mature engagement, I think, for now that we've had. But this really started as a result of a disaster event and some post-disaster work we were doing in the context of some lake level rise and associated humanitarian disaster in Burundi. And there's a general sense around World Bank and development partners that they needed to be a more concerted understanding of the flood risk situation within the city and what would be done in the long run, in addition to dealing with some of the humanitarian work there. So from the beginning of this process, we were able to get to the point of development of the terms of reference with the experts that were connected here, Matthias, Scott, and with the help of Ross, to define a terms of reference that followed up from this preliminary post-disaster work that we did. And we got to a point of contract very quickly with the firm. I think that process of procurement was much simpler than I experienced from a corporate procurement perspective myself. I think there was a lot of heavy lifting that the team did behind the scenes with the corporate procurement team, and so it felt very streamlined from the task team side in terms of what was, you know, I'm sure a very heavy lift on the CRP team end. So that was very useful, very quick. When it came to the bids, I think there's some quite strict rules in terms of the length of proposals that we received. So we got really high quality, really easily digestible proposals, and we're able to make really sort of sound decisions during the evaluation process on that. So I think from a procurement standpoint, it's most streamlined or easy corporate procurement process that I've experienced. So with, you know, big thanks to the team for this. Now, when it came to the work, we followed a similar type of process in Burundi, really trying to understand what were the major flood drivers to the city, both pluvial risk, fluvial, and lake level rise, and where is the sort of the greatest impacts. And we used one of the firms that were one of those 4 firms, and really took an approach of looking at the 6 major catchment areas, understanding what the major drivers there were, to be able to see what is the best mix of solutions and what is the most cost-effective, most optimum areas to intervene from a flood risk perspective. That culminated in a strategic investment plan to sort of detail by catchment area what are the most effective solutions and what would be the most sort of measurable impacts economically and socially. So looking at both structural measures, non-structural measures, and some of the impacts of exposure reduction interventions such as settlement, early warning systems, these sorts of things. In parallel to this, and I think to Claudia's point, there was that aspect of okay, how do we then take this work and what does this mean then operationally? How do we link this? And at the time there was an urban resilience project being prepared. So this was a really awesome opportunity at the same time that preparation was happening to really liaise with the government and counterparts there, really get their feedback on these different aspects of technical products that were produced. Do the flood hazards maps make sense? Does the risk assessment make sense? Really have a clear process of validation with them. I think that contributed to a lot of the ownership and understanding there of the process. And similarly, in terms of the strategic investment plan, that was at a relatively high level in terms of a feasibility type of stage output. Pre-feasibility type of stage output. And I think with the firm, we're able to work very closely with the team preparing the urban resilience project, which would be financing a lot of these measures, to define what are the next sort of subcatchment studies required, what are the next steps required to sort of take this from this preliminary stage into being able to action and implement and design some of these concrete investments. So I think the firm was able to provide very concrete guidance in terms of next steps from this bigger picture, in terms of overall risk, which has a lot of benefits and values in terms of some of the broader work that was being done in city master planning and all of this, but really be able to provide a roadmap into how this can be taken forward at the individual sort of project and operational level. So that's actually the work that's still ongoing now, is the assignment is sort of finishing up. But I think from my view, this sort of both the handbook, but then importantly, the flood framework agreement has shortened the time. I think assured a bit of a quality in terms of the types of firms that you're getting, and a really standardized process. And I think it's been a tremendous amount of utility. So I think we've bitten back in the apple 2 or 3 times in other cities, and it's been quite successful as well. So pause there. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Nick. And I mean, I think with that, to get the overall picture of what is that we are discussing from the offer point of view and from the demand of the different details. Of course, there is still some room for improvement, and we are trying to make this process more efficient, faster, and to be able to inform the operations on time to try to get as soon as possible to start the process, because this, we haven't mentioned this, but this type of assessments take a couple months, several months, sometimes 10 to 12 months. And if you start from the beginning of your engagements with the client, once you have kind of assured that it's a project coming, you will have a better information and a better timing for that. We are trying to see how we overlap this with the PPAs, because these studies go to the pre-feasibility level, and through the project preparations, you can try to get these final designs and the final feasibility studies to improve the readiness in the project. So it would depend how soon this type of assessments start to be able kind of to improve the readiness. As we have been learning ongoing on the process, some of these assessments have finalized after the projects were approved. Of course, it's still informing the project, but it's not that efficient on the readiness that we will love to do. So with this, I'm sorry, I know I'm the moderator, but I wanted to make that comment because also was important from our perspective of the user. Only one small additional comment. We're talking about $300,000, $400,000 in average in most of the assessments that we are doing. Well, if you get a very detailed assessment using, the best resolution in digital terrain models, etc., you will be talking about millions of dollars in the assessments. So in that sense, although it sounds a lot from our TA limited capacity and resources, I think it's a very effective process, but you can expect sometimes that you will need those type of studies of the level of the $1 million within the project to complement whatever is needed to get to the final design. So that's why it is very important kind of to start as soon as possible. So I will stop here. I want to open the floor for any questions or any comments. And I will try to start first with the ones that are connected, because I see the ones in the table is here and they always have an advantage. So there's not many questions on the chat. So if you just want to start your mic and start your question. And I don't know, Rose, there is a question that was posted by Amparo Samper. So while we get more people that want to take the risk, take the mic if you want to answer that one.
Sure. So I see Amparo had to leave, but her questions were around post-contract management to receive good quality outputs. I think a lot of this starts with the preparation phase, where we right-size the TORs to to the most realistic case possible. And this includes both on the technical tasks that are part of an assignment, including making sure that there's reasonable timelines that are defined for each specific task, as well as according to the local context on the ground, to make sure that we're not requesting some technical service like the flood hazard assessment during a time when excess rains, or for example in the country, don't make it possible. So then when it comes to the actual implementation, I'd say from the city resilience program framework side of things, there might be 15 assignments happening simultaneously. So we don't necessarily we're not necessarily controlling each assignment on a day-to-day basis, but we maintain contact with the task teams, and a lot of our framework team members are also working as part of the task teams on each assignment. So there's a good back and forth there, where we can surface any sort of common issues that we find across different studies as they're ongoing. In terms of the resources we invest in contract management, I don't think it's that many. It really just refers to our time in helping to prepare and manage the assignments. And then the biggest contract so far has been the one that Claudia is managing in Niger, which is about $625,000.
You had a large number of cities.
Covering 10 cities, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, I see one hand raised here in the table.
Sure. Thank you. I'm Masa from Lake region. We are specialist. Thank you so much for the presentation and this arrangement. I think it's very useful. So one question. So for the TTL to utilize this system, so I have two questions. For example, do we have a flexibility to do, for example, I usually encourage in the TOR to work international firms with the local firms so that they can facilitate the data collection, government engagement, the languages and those. So is that possible thing? And then other thing is sometimes like some other firms, like in addition to those four, like is very familiar with the regions or like a previous experience of those, and can we invite them to the RFP so that they can also compete, or what's the flexibility we allowed as a DPS?
Yeah, thanks, Masa. So we absolutely encourage, to the greatest extent possible, as much engagement with local firms, as can be, to ensure both, really at every stage of the process that there's local capacity being built and the local resources being utilized for the best delivery. So the firms already have consortium members as part of their frameworks, but they're completely free and flexible to add any other potential subcontractors along the way for each specific call-off assignment, both local organizations, NGOs, firms, as well as individuals. And in addition, my understanding is that at the World Bank in general, any contract needs to be at least 50% of it needs to be run or owned by a lead firm, whoever is the prime bidder. But for this particular framework, we've received special dispensation for procurement to remove that minimum threshold. So in the event that a firm decides that it only needs to do, for example, let's say 30% of the work, and the rest of the work would be done by a combination of local or other international resources, we can do that as well.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Any other questions on the people connected in the chat? We have more than 70, 80 persons connected. Please don't be shy.
You can let the chat go first.
Okay, since I don't see any hands raising on anyone opening the mic. Oh, okay, I see. It's asking if the toolkit will be translated in other languages to benefit other local actors.
Yes, so the handbook is, as we speak, in the process of being translated into French as well as into Vietnamese.
If you are interested, you can pass co-finance it, and we will be translating into other languages too.
Yes.
Claudia?
Yes, quickly about the framework agreement for land use planning. Is that kind of an addition to the flood risk assessment, or is it assessment? The first one, is the second one kind of easier to get, or how are they related? Or they're not?
Well, so at the framework level, they're really two separate frameworks, two separate contract mechanisms and separate contracts between the bank and the individual service providers. We're in the bidding process right now, so we'll have to see how it shakes out in terms of who wins. But there's some repeated demand from the private market, right? So some of the same, or all the same firms have been part of the process in one way or another. So I guess each assignment would be its own piece of work. But I would say in almost every case, if it has been done in the same country or same city context, there would almost certainly be outputs to build upon and connect to.
Is there a similar handbook being prepared for that?
Oh, yes, thanks for bringing that up. And so in parallel to that framework, we are also in the process of writing a guidance note on risk-informed land use planning, which will cover to some part flood hazard as well. And this is being led by Ibru, who's in the room here.
But one idea is that it would be an excellent complementarity because you already have the hazard and the risk information. And the next step that you want to do in the project is implement that process of incorporating risk-sensitive land use planning. One of the things that that framework has is that it has different stages also. So if you are in the engagement statement and you don't know what is the type of regulation that country has, what has been the practices, and what are the gaps, so that framework contract can help you on that assessment. If you already have an engagement, but you see that your planning doesn't have the capacity, so it will be able to provide you with the technical assistance for the process. As you know, we as a World Bank will be able kind of to do the plans for the client. It's focused to accompany the process, to transfer the knowledge, and to make the assessment on what would be the right tools for the capacity and the context, because this is not one size fits all, no? The level of sophistication of the type of plans that you can find everywhere depends on the level of advances and capacities that we have in our client countries. Sorry, I think I forget my moderator role sometimes. Sorry.
Thanks. Scott mentioned the different types of flooding and mentioned, I think, that flash flooding is usually the most disastrous. And then the inputs we would want to put into a model for flash flooding is always changing and different. So how is, so compared to, let's say, if we have 100-year floods or 50-year floods or high tide floods or king tide floods and so forth and so on, those are a little bit more predictable, though exasperated and more frequent, more intense. Still, the inputs that go into it are rather predictable. But for flash flooding, it could be so many different things that come together to make that. So, what is there something in here for the modeling of those? Or sorry.
No, I think, yeah, let's turn it to Scott and Matthias.
I asked mainly because my home state in India had the monsoon came 17 days early. There was snow melt, glacier melt, a cloud burst, and thousands and thousands of lives were lost. And nobody could have predicted that, like all of that to happen in that one day in these few hours. So that's why I asked about the flash flooding.
Shall I? I'll kick off. That's a really good question. And I mean, in theory, if a flood risk consultant is worth their salt, then they will look at every possibility that could happen in a particular area and identify the causes and the data needs, and they would carry out a flood risk assessment that would cover all these extreme events. That, as you rightly say, is not always possible, and these things come out of the blue and can be a complete surprise. But I think one of the things that has started being promoted, and it's only just started, is a full probabilistic approach. So the approach that we generally use isn't a full probabilistic. There's confusion about the actual name probabilistic, but it's not a full probabilistic assessment that we normally do. But there have been a few situations where that has been applied, and the beauty of a fully probabilistic assessment is you capture everything you reasonably can do, and although it's less accurate, because it's looking at 10,000 years worth of possible events, it actually gives you, in theory, it should capture everything that could possibly happen, and that might be one outlier, and that might only happen once in 10,000 years. But in theory, if they've done their job properly, then they will have actually captured that. It's fairly new. We've done it in Dar es Salaam. We're looking at doing it in Malawi. So it's a kind of early stages of doing this kind of work. There are a few firms that are good at it, and there aren't many. But that's the way forward, I think. It's a really interesting way of doing things, because in theory, as time goes by, as people become better at doing it this way, it will become easier to do, but also easier to understand, because the outputs of it, because they're probabilistic, are a little bit more complicated to understand as well. So it's coming, but yeah, there is no easy answer.
Thank you.
I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Scott. I think we are getting to the end and running out of time. So I will want to hand it over to Nils for the closing remarks.
All righty. Well, thanks a lot, Anna. Thanks everyone for participating, for listening in. Thanks to Scott and Matthias for your presentations, to Claudia and Nick here in the room, to Horacio Connected for your comments, and of course to Ross and my own team for leading the process on our side. I took a bunch of notes. Look, I have a whole paper full of notes. That's normally an indication that I'm learning, which is great. I love learning. This is, if you're already working in it, you already know this is a complicated area. I am sure you picked that up from some of the presentations. I hope the work that we're trying to do helps, I would say, well, Ross calls it democratizing access to urban flood risk management, which I think means enabling more people to do reasonable thing in the space of urban risk management. And if we can achieve that, then I think my team and my unit is playing a successful role in the bigger scheme of things. We had about 80 some people connected, so there certainly is interest in this space. If any of you, especially those of you working in the regions as TTLs or working on task teams, if you see other risk management areas where you see a repeated engagement, you continue to struggle with the complexity, it seems inefficient the way we're currently doing it, flag it to us anytime. Our role is to try to pick up that kind of tasks and see if we can help you and the bank do it in a better way to offer better risk management to our clients. Please do reach out to Ross if you are interested in engaging with the contract, if you want a hard copy of the flood risk handbook, any other services, of course, from the City Resilience Program. I think we will develop capacity, Claudia, to your specific question over time that helps advise on how these different products may link together. We're doing another one because we're seeing a similar need, but at this stage, I don't think we know exactly how the two, we think they will complement each other. We are aiming at producing something that will complement the flood risk, but we'll have to learn a bit over time, learn with you and learn with other teams like you. I want to make a quick plug for a few other things that was mentioned during this conversation, the Open Data Library. We're trying to promote from our global position that those of you who procure this type of processes or any other risk assessment or hazard assessment process, that you think of the data that you're creating as part of the outcomes that you're trying to produce. And this goes beyond what the typical task team in the bank would normally do. It's super important. You heard several people talk about the cost of data. For any of these processes, the primary cost driver is not all the smart people you need involved to get the product done. That is costly, but that's not the primary cost driver. The primary cost driver is the data. And we have, I would almost think, an obligation to become better at the data part. We do have advice. We have people who specialize in that piece of the puzzle. So if any of you want support in that, we're happy to engage with you as well. There were a few references to nature as one structural method you can use or combine with a gray approach. We have a full team that focuses just on that and how to combine it with gray or how to do it on its own. We have another set of products and services that you can access. So please do reach out. We're working on one more framework contract related to emergency preparedness and response. So if any of you work and operate in the space of emergency preparedness, we already have a number of services we are offering, but we're trying to take some of those services into a similar procurement format. And at the end of the day, across the various lines we have at GFGR, I think we're trying to offer maybe 4 different types of services to operational teams in the regions. There's the technical knowledge, of course, and you saw some of that unbundled in this conversation. Operational support is key. We're not academia. We're trying to enable the bank to become more efficient development partner on these risk issues. So helping you think through things like relevant indicators that relates to that technical service or how to get it done in your operational context is a key piece of what we hope to do. You saw a glimpse of the procurement related support. We can offer some task teams, at least on the BETF side of things. And of course, there's a good deal of contract management that's built into what Ross was showing in the framework. So don't hesitate, come to us. I did take note, Claudia, of all the challenges. I think these are very nicely laid out challenges that we can also start to think of how we can help you with. I do think some of them are not intended to be addressed in this particular process, and therefore they are not, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't be thinking about the next step also in the context of when we're doing this. So we'll be looking into that. Thank you everyone for joining here in the room. Thanks for those of you who joined online. And please do reach out to me or to Ross, to Anna, to anyone else involved here. Anna, she's part of my global team, even though her day job is for a manager on Africa, but I don't care about that. So, so please do reach out. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, thanks.
Thank you so much.